evening and welcome to this, the February 3rd edition of Beyond the Headlines. My name is Colin Dowe and I will serve as per usual as your host this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, whether you're at home, you're driving home, you're at one of our bars or some other outlet, tuned in, GBN Television, GBN Radio, or any of our social media platforms. Thank you so very much for sharing part of your Monday evening with us. We have a very topical topic this evening as we reflect on the implications and the ripple effect, as it were, of the new U.S. policies. And we have two experts with us. We look at it both from an economic standpoint and from a human rights standpoint, because of course things like tariffs would be in the news, mass deportation in the news. So I'm welcoming online Jacqueline McKenzie, who's a human rights attorney in the UK, good Grenadian. Welcome, good morning, Jackie, and welcome.
Thank you. Yes, good morning.
And let me just share again my appreciation for you, because I know that you're in the UK, you're 5 hours ahead of us, so you're putting in more than extra time to be with us and bring some enlightenment to this topic. So we're eternally grateful for that.
My pleasure.
All right. And in studio, didn't have to travel as far. We have Dr. Stephen Fletcher, who is an economist by training. Dr. Fletcher, welcome back to Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Excellent. And let's just roll into the topic. Why, Dr. Fletcher, is U.S. politics so important to Grenada and the region? Why does it matter to us?
Yeah. Let me again say good night to all of your listeners, viewers, wherever they might be doing, participating in this program this evening. The question is really key, and I suppose the fact that you have framed the topic the way that you did tonight is because of that real importance. U.S.-Caribbean relations, and certainly U.S.-Grenada relations, has always been of really high priority and importance for the Grenadian people. And on many fronts, the U.S. is one of the closest geographically developed country in the world that we have had a long history of travels, of work, of economic activity with. A significant number of our Caribbean people lives in the United States. In fact, is estimated probably over 4.4 million persons or so from the Caribbean generally resides in the U.S., which going to makes it probably approximately a significant percentage of the population. From the Grenadian perspective as well, it is said, colloquially, that we have more Grenadians residing in the U.S. than the population of Grenada, right, thus indicating the significant number of persons, and that include first and second and third generation of Grenadians who are living out there. So from the people-to-people's point of view, there's that connection, there's that connectivity with the U.S. The geography, the closeness thus makes it important. Second, and very importantly, is the economic issue. You look around Grenada, you walk around, and you can have visual signs of persons who resided and worked in the U.S. and the investment that they have made back here. The whole issue of remittances is also significant for the Grenadian population, for Grenadian households, for assisting with families attending school, meeting daily expenses, and so forth. It is economically significant. It is also a place for tourism for a lot of our Grenadian people. Believe it or not, I think the data will show that certainly over the past decade or two, increasingly Grenadians are going to the United States for vacation purposes, simply vacate. And sometimes you have persons going there twice, 3 times per year for vacation purposes. So we have this very intimate relationship with the United States. I think the best from an economic point of view and also from a social point of view, I think Maurice Bishop, or former late Prime Minister, captioned it very well. I think when he said, and you can direct me on this, that when the United States sneezes, we catch a cold, right? And it's a clear indication of the close relationship that exists economically, socially, politically with the United States. So there have been this mutual issue there. But also, let us pivot a little bit to cite the strategic importance, the geographic strategic importance that the United States places on the Caribbean, and certainly Grenada. Even it's from a pure, as I said, strategic military point of view. The whole Caribbean basin is perceived by the United States as, quote unquote, has been in our backyard, has been very close relationships, and therefore for Grenada and for the United States, that is important. And as we go through the discussions, we'll realize that United States assistance to the Caribbean seems to spike whenever there is a perceived threat, real or perceived, of other nations influencing Caribbean affairs.
Well, before we get there, Jackie, we are days away from celebrating our 51st anniversary of Grenada's independence. And the question is whether strategically we should have a developmental trajectory that takes us away from this dependence on the U.S., one, and two, is that even possible? Or am I just speaking theory here?
I think it's very difficult, really, because, as Stephen said, we're so interdependent. I don't think Grenada is so dependent on the US economically. In fact, when I looked at some data today, Grenada only seems to export about $10 million worth of products to the US, because I was quite concerned looking at how President Trump, and I mean, he is an extremely unstable president. He's come back with a vengeance. We won't know what he's up to day by day. He will change. We saw today with the tariffs with Mexico and Canada that he can change his mind at a whim. And so I thought, my goodness, how is that going to impact on Grenada? Well, fortunately, we don't seem to export that much. And but we are, Stephen mentioned remittances, and we are hugely reliant on the US for those remittances. Now, I haven't seen any data that says what the proportion of Caribbean people, of the 6 million is the figure I saw for people from the Caribbean residents in the United States, formerly through the IC system and also informally as undocumented migrants. What proportion of those are Grenadian? But anecdotally, we are told that there are more Grenadians in the US than there are in Grenada itself, Grenada, Caribbean, Martinique. And we now know, once upon a time, all the large houses that you saw being built, the majority of the remittances that were coming into Grenada were actually coming from the United Kingdom. That has changed. We're now on to a fourth and a fifth generation who don't have that pull and affinity to Grenada in the same way. But the US has replaced that. The large properties, the investment, the businesses, the families. And, you know, this whole issue around immigration is going to be important, because there are going to be lots of people. And I mean, at the moment, what we're seeing is a sort of kind of melee of people being dragged out of prisons and put on planes. And that's not really, that's just for show. But there will be large numbers of undocumented Grenadians who do contribute to those remittances, who will be frightened to go to work, so who will leave their jobs, and that will impact on remittances. There will be some, and I think very small numbers, there will be some who will be returned. And so that's where I think there is a major impact on Grenada's economy. In terms of what Grenada ought to be doing, I am a great believer, and we saw it during the Grenada Revolution, of self-determination and self-development. And I think we're seeing a little bit of it now in Grenada. But that, we really ought to be less dependent on any country, really. We ought to look inwardly, or if we're looking outwardly, to the skills and capital that exists amongst our people in the diaspora. And I don't think Grenada is very good at tapping into the diaspora. There's been lots of initiatives. I don't think they've worked, because I don't think the resources have gone into making them work. But I think that Grenada, with its size and its population, can do much better, and it can do much better without that heavy reliance. We've already seen Elon Musk, who seems to be the deputy president, saying that US aid is going. I don't know how much Grenada gets from US aid. but those funds are likely to dry up. What's very worrying for me, though, is that you have in the White House now somebody who's a climate change denier, somebody who's anti-reparations, somebody who's against foreign aid. All of those things are likely to impact significantly on the Caribbean, because the Caribbean faces, and Grenada does, significant changes through the climate crisis. Grenada really does need reparations to assist it in its own inward examination of development and delivery of development. And it also needs to have, as the region as a zone of peace. That needs to be retained. And what we're going to see with Trump is CARICOM being polarized, as you have some members. I mean, we saw in, I think it was 2019, where he tried to divide up Caribbean leaders. He had that meeting that Jamaica and Bahamas and some countries attended, and others were annoyed about that. And we're now going to see that. We're going to see that over some of the big ticket issues. Cuba, I mean, he's already, put Cuba back on a sanction list as being a terrorist state. I mean, that's just unconscionable and inexplicable. Venezuela is going to be polarizing, possibly countries like Trinidad and Barbados. So I think we're going to see some destabilization in CARICOM as one state's picked the other. We're going to see less prioritization of the important things that need to be done in the region and that the US ought to play a role in terms of, guaranteeing or trying to undo some of the damage of climate change. I mean, the US is a number one polluter in our region. And so I think, it is important from diplomacy, from economics, from remittances, even in our own nationals trying to get to the US may be more difficult. I think there are a number of areas where we ought to be concerned when we have somebody so unstable in that position.
Okay. Stephen, a lot to unpack here based on the sharings, but economically, is the Caribbean still this dependent on U.S. developmental aid? And the threat, as it were, to USAID, that U.S. Agency for International Development, and they're being attempt to pull it under the State Department, the argument being that their work must be consistent with the foreign policies of the State Department, and then rather than having it as a separate statutory body, pulling it under. But realistically, are we as dependent as we were before on U.S. developmental aid? Right.
So again, this is a very key question, and I think Jackie alluded to it earlier on. Let us just step back and put something in context here. And what we have to put in context really is, what are the objectives of U.S. foreign policy? Right? And if we have some notions of that, we'll see where we fit. So I would say that U.S. foreign policy is always, and a country's foreign policy is always a reflection of its own domestic situation, its domestic policies, and how we seek to basically play that out on the international scene, how that get extrapolated onto the international stage. So in the last few years, decades, and you'll see it consistently on the various U.S. governments, whether it's Democratic or Republican, the objective seems to remain the same, but practiced differently. So objectives such as curtailing influences from other countries remain important for the U.S. in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Secondly, controlling of migration, narcotics, and so on is important. And also, thirdly, I will say, the continuation of U.S. policy to establish a unipolar world, where the United States is seen as the master of the world, where they seek to exercise hegemony, literally, in international relations, especially since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the socialist experiment, and so on. But however, they are now contended with the rise of a multipolar world, as countries like the BRIC country members of the BRICS certainly have emerged in a very strong way. So in the past decades, to the question as to what extent the Caribbean is dependent on U.S. aid, And I take it here that you refer mainly to grant aid, grant financing, rather than investments in itself. So over the years, I think it is true to say that we have seen a boom and bust of focus on the Caribbean. And whenever there seems to be a focus on the Caribbean in terms of aid, it's because there is a perceived external threat that the Caribbean faces, that the U.S. faces, in their view, from their policy point of view, their strategic thinking, that then cause a certain amount of flurry of activities within the Caribbean. I cannot recall the actual data now, but it is true to say that over the years, we have seen the grant component of aid declining for Caribbean countries, and certainly for Grenada. So in the 1970s, for example, so between 1959 with Cuba and so on and decline to 1979, U.S. aid in the Caribbean seems to decline. It picked up in the 70s, in the late 70s, when you had the Nicaraguan Revolution, you had the Grenada Revolution, and the specter of a resuscitated USSR at the time impacting the Caribbean of flowing. We saw fluttering of aid and a number of policy initiatives, including, but not limited to, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which is an investment and business relationship between the Caribbean and the United States. In the 1990s, especially following the collapse of the Grenada Revolution, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, and what was perceived then as the emergence of the United States, the Caribbean assistance to the Caribbean declined. And we have to understand that and ask ourselves, what are the strategic importance of the Caribbean to the United States? And certainly Grenada. What is the importance? What is the value? Tourism is probably our greatest source of revenue from the U.S. to
so the U.S. remains Grenada's one source market.
Source market, but not in terms of actual trade. And I think Jackie was correct when she pointed out in terms of the exports, for example.
Well, the exports. But the question in terms of dependence, what is our imports precisely?
And that is where we have to needle into, I hope later on, to see what are the likely impacts of the Trump's administration tariff measures on key manufacturers and producers of the world, like China, Canada, Mexico, on prices in the Caribbean.
I want us to get to that, but just in terms of the developmental aid coming from the U.S., because if we look at the thrust of the USAID in particular, I think budgeted last year, or the arguments by the Biden administration was to put forward about $22 billion to Latin America and the Caribbean on developmental aid. That is going on pause, or has gone on pause. And the thrust was things to, like what Jackie alluded to, the idea of climate change, energy, the climate resilience thrust, etc. The spikes that you mentioned was not only when there was a Cold War on, because aid when there's disaster would also cause spikes. So the earthquake in Haiti, etc., we saw monies running there. But if we're looking at the development of our society, not reactive now, as a partner for development, that seems to be non-existent, or at least I don't know if you can point to things.
Absolutely, I think you're absolutely correct, and you're correct in pointing out that the aid seems to rush through when there's a natural disaster of some sort or the other that comes in. But in terms of a partner in development, a partner in issues of our social development, investment possibilities and potentials, direct aid, right? And hence, the absence of that direct U.S. investment in the Caribbean over the years has been attributed to the rise of the influence of the People's Republic of China within the Caribbean sphere generally, which is now causing the U.S. Quite a bit of concern in terms of the spheres of influence. So we have seen that happening in generally throughout. The U.S. is there when there is some assistance, militarily as well. I mean, I was in my research, you will see that there have been partnerships with countries like Trinidad and Tobago. There is Barbados and so on, and there's the Caribbean Business Strategic Initiative, which is fundamentally a military intelligence kind of network.
Well, yes, and support both in terms of maritime and air. Air for the region, correct?
The region. At the economic front and at the grant fund, very, very little. And this is why, Colin, it is important for us as Grenadians and certainly policymakers to pay attention to this issue regarding the American pulling out of and stopping aid to or funding to organizations like the World Health Organization, to UNESCO and so forth, because it has direct impact on what we receive from these organizations. The WHO has been a consistent partner with countries like small island developing states in our healthcare system. We saw it during COVID. They were there, right? Countries like, organizations like UNESCO are also very important in helping our education, our cultural arts. I mean, I was ambassador at the time in Brussels, and Grenada's permanent representative to UNESCO. I think it might have been around 2011, 2010, around there, when the Obama administration at the time really pulled out of and ceased funding to UNESCO over the issue of the acceptance of the Palestinians' offer or application to become a member of UNESCO, and there was ceasing of funds. The activities dropped a bit. Other countries attempted to meet that gap, but not fully. But again, Grenadians, we got to understand the benefit we receive from those organizations, and through them and the U.S. influence comes in, because the U.S. is an economic powerhouse as of now, right?
Well, today.
As of now,
today.
Right?
Jackie.
So we have to look at those kinds of impact and how it's going to trickle down and affect the individual family households and so in Grenada.
Right.
So there has been a deviation.
Jackie, we have this movement by the current administration in the U.S. Are you of the belief that private investments would follow? So the U.S. government may decide that, we're not going to fund WHO, PAHO, etc. We will reel in the USAID and IAF, which is the Inter-American Foundation. Would private entities like the Bill Gates Foundation, for example, who does quite a bit of work within developing countries, will they start scaling back as well, in your mind?
I have no idea. And I have problems with organizations like the Bill Gates Foundation anyway, so I'm probably the worst person to ask. I think really it's more about self-determination and self-development. One of the interesting things, I've just spent a couple months in Grenada, and I was absolutely appalled by what was on sale in the supermarket. You hardly find anything that's Grenadian in them. I mean, almost everything is from the US. Most of it's monster food. I saw things that said fake mozzarella in one of the supermarkets. I won't name them because I don't want to get sued, but I did raise it with the manager. What on earth does that mean? Or the chicken that comes in and all of that stuff. I just couldn't shop. I couldn't find anything to buy. And I saw, when I was looking in preparation for tonight's program, I decided to have a look and see what data was around, and I saw the figure of how much we export to the US, and then I saw what we import, and it was 10 times that, and a huge amount. I mean, I know, of course, fuel and those high up on the list, and manufacturing goods and so forth, but also food. And why are we importing chicken from the United States and eggs and cheese and things? Why are we doing it? And that you started off by saying, we're marking our 51st anniversary of independence. And I think there needs to be more discussion about how we can do more for ourselves, because there's so many talented people, skilled people, there's land, there's capital in the banks. And I just couldn't get it. I couldn't understand what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm. And, what is the benefit? I know that Stephen alluded to some, but in your mind, what is the benefit to the U.S., of giving aid to the region in this era. I mean, I'm putting myself in Trump's shoes now. Why should we be spending this money on these folks? English-speaking Caribbean is barely 7 million. Why?
Well, they only do it as part of their own foreign policy ideology, really, and we see so little of it really coming. I'm sure we could do without it if we put our minds to our own self-determination, which I keep repeating, but we get very little, and they continue to give. Stephen was right when he said we see, the peaks and the troughs when there's an incident, when there's an issue, post the Grenada Revolution, post the invasion, lots of aid came in. Then when they thought things were fine, it kind of petered out again, and, they look at what's going on around the world with Alba and Venezuela giving to the region. Aid increased again. We'll see it now with BRICS, the development of BRICS. Just today, Nigeria joined BRICS. That's strengthening as a bloc. So aid may be a focus, but the aid is minuscule. I mean, I haven't seen any real assessment of what American aid does for Grenada. And Stephen's right to talk about those important organizations which are aligned to the UN. They're UN agencies, and I deal a lot with the UN, UNHCR, which deals with refugees. Absolutely crucial. Grenada doesn't have that as a big issue at the moment, but W Health Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF, and many others are important, and they're at risk because they're funding. I mean, who knows? I mean, Trump could even come out of the UN altogether. So there are some real problems because we get aid indirectly through some of the projects that are funded. But I think Grenada spends, sometimes when I'm there, I just keep seeing events and activities. It's World this day or it's World that day. And, there's a tent or a marquee somewhere and everybody comes along and has an injection or gets their blood. It's almost like we're a school being run by a parent-teachers association. Lots of events and activities, all funded by, this foreign body or that. And we have people in Grenada who could do those things. We have doctors, we have money, we have land, we have space. We just need to get more creative and not worry. Our development goals should have absolutely nothing to do with the United States. What we do want of the United States is to make sure they create no mischief in our region, that they don't do anything that detracts from our region remaining a zone of peace, because there are some tension points: Guyana, Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti. And that they don't roll back on some of the agreements that have come out of the various COPs on climate change and climate resilience, as you quite rightly pointed out, because they're the number one polluter. And a lot of the problems that we experience in the region are caused by them. So we really need them to have good governance, to be fair, to be just, to be equitable, to look after our people there, but also to safeguard our nations. But what we don't need is little bits of money from them. We've gone past that, I think.
Okay. It's time for our first break. So when we come back, we look at areas of assistance based on their priorities, if it's needed, and how it has worked. We'll be right back.
On Sunday, February 9th, the St. Paul's Community Center will come alive with the St. Paul's Independence Extravaganza. It's an explosion of food, craft, exhibition, and art display with performances by Solid the Band, Tamara Songbird St. Bernard, Dash, Lion Pride Percussions, Japs, Jab King, Lisa McDonald, Sakina and the Alpha One Band, Conception Dance Theater, Core Band Comancheros, and more. All the action starts from 12 noon. It's the St. Paul's Independence Extravaganza, a production of the St. Paul Sports, Cultural and Development Organization, and powered by Judah Sound System.
Come and see for yourself. Don't be all what we sell. Want a country and tell. unlocking opportunities. Excel leads the way in digital advancement every single day. Fair internet access for all to share. Transparent billing with consumer care. Excel 3EC bill safeguarding our rights. Net neutrality, consumer protection shining bright. Mobile number portability available to you. Switch providers seamlessly. Keep the number true. Excel 3EC bill promoting fair play in the digital world. Every single day, affordable services are important for all. Through the EC bill, there'll be progress overall. Excel and the NTRCs connecting our communities.
Excel and the NTRCs digitally transforming our space together.
Grenadians, the National Celebrations Committee invites you to celebrate the next 50, embracing a future of development, transformation, and unity as we ready ourselves to mark the Grenadians' 51st anniversary of independence. On February 7th, 2025, activities include the Independence Monarch Competition semifinals, January 25th at Lassages Playing Field, with the final carded for Saturday, February 1st at the Sutters Bus Terminal. National Church Service, February 2nd, 3 p.m., Crossroad RC Church. February 6th, National Colors Day, Interministerial Competition and Independence Cultural Extravaganza from 7 p.m. at the Grenfell Bus Terminal. And on Friday, 7th, it's the grand finale at the Kirani James Athletic Stadium, the Independence Day Rally, Military Parade, and Made in Grenada Expo. Let's all celebrate in true Grenadian unity, the anniversary of our 51st independence.
Grenada is such a beautiful country.
Get so much more with Courts Ready Finance. Whether it's a furniture upgrade or appliance replacement, it's easy when you shop using Courts Ready Finance. Get more flexibility by choosing your payment terms, more affordability with low monthly payments, and more access with fast and easy application. Plus, there's no down payment and you make your first payment in 30 days. Get great deals and gifts with select purchase. Get so much more with Courts Ready Finance. Only at Courts. Bringing value home. Special conditions apply.
Back, viewers and listeners, and we're looking at the ripple effects of the new U.S. policies on Grenada and the Caribbean with Jacqueline McKenzie and Stephen Fletcher. Stephen, let's just look at some of the areas identified within the budget as presented by former President Biden. It was $2.2 billion, I think, was the overall amount, and geared towards developmental assistance in terms of like social welfare programs, disaster response. There's the Economic Support Fund. There are global health. That's another theme that was under it. The International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement Initiatives, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, strategic initiative that you mentioned, as well as anti-terrorism. That was all of the things catered to under that $2.2 billion. Have we been seeing that type of investment coming through the region, coming through to Grenada in particular in those areas?
Absolutely. I mean, so let us bear in mind that the reference you have just made is recent. Is a recent reference to former President Biden. That was approved by Congress.
This is now on pause.
That is on pause.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I'll say beyond pause. It's probably unraveling as we speak, right? And it's likely to be unraveled. I don't think so. I think so. For example, as you have mentioned, the issue of the Food for Peace Act, right? The foreign operations-related programs, the Millennium Challenge, the Peace Corps, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. At the economic level, they have the Economic Support Fund, which has an estimated of $523.5 million in it. But again, in that fund, is migration management. Is embedded in the economic program. The global health is there, international narcotics and so forth. So yes, these are all good programs. These are programs, and certainly foreign military aid, right? Foreign military aid is also important. So these are all important and it's part of the mix for the global arena, for the global community, and certainly for Grenada. We need that kind of assistance. But let us reflect a little bit here and ask, what are real development needs at this point? What do we need? In addition to this, we have to put some plus signs behind this. What are our infrastructural needs at this point? What are our needs regarding to the impact of climate change? And we have seen what happened with burial, what happened with heavy rainfalls. Now we get quite an alarming set of headlines when there is a burial. But outside of burial, we also experience heavy rainfalls and significant drought conditions that poses serious impact on the livelihoods of our people. The infrastructural needs, our telecommunication needs, right? Where is this coming from to a large extent? It is still dependent heavily on external sources. In fact, I've been working on a paper for the last year or so, looking at how foreign aid assisted in the development of Grenada 1979 to 1983. Significant. But I think what we ought to be looking at now, more than ever, and the slogan was Conjuring the Revolution in terms of eat what you grow what you eat, and so on. We have to I think there is some looking at it already internally, to look at our internal space and ask ourselves, what can we do as a people for self-development? What can we do as a region as well? How can we combine our resources together as a people that really will aid the development of our people? We have the intellectual capital among us. We have some of the financial resources that we have. And I think we need to begin to look more and more internally. On the food security issue, that is also an important one. Certainly, the rural development unit, through the Climate Smart Agricultural and Enterprise Program, have been focusing and working on small farmers to increase production, to increase the livelihoods of individual households, and to improve the quality of life. We need more of that. We need to really encourage these things to happen, and we need to grow the economy. But let us not be blindsided here by thinking that if we ought to embark on an internal reflection and an internal investment of our resources, our human capital, our human spirit, that it is going to necessarily provide us with the developmental thrust that we need altogether. We are part of the international community and will forever be integrated into that global space. Our interdependence, we are into an interdependent world more and more, despite attempts to decouple, right, some countries from the rest of us. But we're interdependent. What I think is important for Grenada to do is to begin to think strategically as to how Grenada can position itself to ensure that we leverage international assistance for the good of our people, for the improvement of the quality of life of our people, for the improvement of our society overall, our human capital. What can we do to make Grenada a better place in the future based on how we leverage the resources that are available to us today, locally, internationally, regionally.
All right. Jackie, if I can just bring you in here, and are we really in a position to negotiate? We hear the list of things that USAID, for example, and the IF were responsible for, and one signature, and it can disappear. But how can we leverage the perceived importance of Grenada and the region in negotiating deals for our benefit? If it is one nation, one vote in the UN, and we do get aid when we go to like the Whaling Commission and others, some say that we sell our vote, but if we are to look internally and we need to get that capital to assist a developmental thrust that we decide is important to us, can we realistically negotiate with the likes of the U.S. to ensure that monies are spent differently in order to assist that developmental trajectory?
I think Grenada, as a small state, a small nation state, could negotiate with the United States if you have a reasonable person leading the government. But I don't think you have that. You have somebody who's
petulant. And we're referring now to the U.S. government.
Yes, so I don't think you can. And so I think really Grenada has to work, and it is doing, within the CARICOM structure. That's the structure. You've got to go as a block, haven't you? There's strength, and you talked about the Whaling Commission. I mean, Japan only shows any interest because, there's 14 votes and some other votes if you include the associate members. You get quite a lot of people. So, it's all cynical, isn't it? It's all, sort of the global games. But I think one of the things that does worry me about Trump is how he might play out the region against each other over things, and I said it at the start, Cuba and Haiti and Venezuela. And whether that could cause some friction in CARICOM, because there are very few CARICOM states that have the clout to be able to negotiate solely. I think our power is in being a bloc. So I don't think Trump's going to be listening to Grenada at all, if I'm honest.
Okay. Go ahead.
If I may just chip in here, I do think as well, Jackie, and I'm sure you're going to agree, and some of our listeners and viewers, is that this may very well be as well a period for opportunities for us to look at. In other words, having faced with this challenge that we have, perceived a real challenge in the new U.S. administration, I said, what are the opportunities that exist there for us? Can we explore and exploit opportunities? For example, we talked about the internal national focus, but let us also look at it from the point of view of South-South cooperation. How can we intensify and integrate ourselves more in South-South cooperation? How can we do that? The revolution has set an example for us, PRG, that whereas we worked well within the CARICOM structure, within regional structures and so on, but we also had a very focused, a very strategic, and a very thoughtful foreign policy in which much of our system, much of our development that we got through in those years came from bilateral relations. We were able to leverage bilateral relations extremely well. Yes, it was a different time. It was a time when we had the East-West divide, and Grenada was perceived as being one of the aligned to the Eastern Bloc countries, and therefore received some assistance. But this is half of the story. The other half of Grenada's developmental aid and assistance during the 79 to 83 period came from Western countries. It came from the UK, it came from Canada, it came from, I think, Norway and Sweden and those countries as well. So Grenada on its own also has that ability. And we must, in fact, may I say, while working within CARICOM, while being a sort of regionalist, we also have strategic value. And Grenada has always been able to punch over its weight many a times in the regional and international community. But we have to focus on intensifying bilateral relations. The Prime Minister's delegation to the PRC recently have signed some 14 MOUs. I don't know the content, I don't know what they speak to, but certainly I will guess that those MOUs will be very substantial in our developmental efforts, to aid our development effort. So can we do that? Can we look at BRICS, right, and deepen relationships there? This new administration as well, we can see have also really looking at developing and opening new and reviving new relationships with different regions of the world. Certainly the Middle East is one of those countries. If we look at countries like Saudi Arabia and Dubai and so on, where we have been having delegations, visiting delegations coming through, shows that there is some thinking and some thought going through in the way that we shape our foreign policy for aid and development.
How do we strike that balance, recognizing that in the crosshairs of the U.S. is Panama, claiming that China is taking over the canal, is Greenland, who would have thought, because of the Chinese influence. And of course, there's a major thrust by President Xi with the Belt and Road project. So the closer we get to China, the more attention we may attract from the U.S., negative attention. And this conversation here of the ripple effect of being punished by the mighty U.S. might just be a result.
Right. So that is a spectrum.
But punished in what way? Can I just ask? Punished in what way? Because what is it that we get from the United States at the moment that we want, that we might have to forego? What is it? I'm surprised. Nobody's mentioned Africa. Africa is a powerhouse. Some of the countries are within BRICS. Some of CARICOM countries, Myanmar in particular, are looking to Africa. Trinidad has looked to Africa. Stephen's absolutely right about forging new relationships. And we are doing that. You mentioned some of them. China, this government's gone to China, previous governments went to China. We are doing that. You mentioned the UK, you're going to get nothing from the UK. The UK has nothing to give anyway. These old countries, forget it. We've got to be dynamic. We've got to look inwardly at our own skills, resources, and our own capital, and social capital, intellectual capital, and real money. And we've got to look at building new relationships. And I think Africa, the whole of Africa, is a region that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, and I think when Stephen mentioned the Middle East, I thought actually you were going to be mentioning Africa, because I think we have had more conversations on that type of South-South relationship, certainly with the continent.
Well, absolutely. Been served in Brussels for a while, and from our very origin and my own development, Africa is the place to go. The relationship, we ought to consolidate that relationship with the African continent as a people. This is the most resourced continent in the world, really and truly. So Africa is a place we have to develop these relationships with. I think the guiding principle from our developmental trust point of view, one of the guiding principles, we have to be friends of many, enemies of none. We are small. We have a high level of dependency. We cannot get rid of that. We cannot be blinded by it. And as we embark on this self-development thrust, we also have to be cognizant of our space, where we operate from, where our inputs come from, what are some of the things that we get from. So whereas we ought to maintain what we call, quote unquote, the traditional relationships, we have to strike that balance in expanding the relationship. In fact, the truth is that the data is telling us that, the foreign affairs academics are telling us that, the practitioners are saying that the U.S. global hegemonic outlook is on the decline. There are other poles of power, not just military power, but resource power, that are emerging. And where countries like Grenada, seeds and so on, developing states, will find much comfort and resources and the exchange. But Grenada is resourceful. I know we're not ready to get into the deportation discussion as yet, but within that space, within that diasporic space, we have financial resources, we have intellectual capital that we can draw from and we need to draw from as a matter of urgency and so on, to help achieve the developmental trust that we are looking for. So I do not, let me rephrase this. I will encourage us as a population, as a region, not to necessarily panic at the changes in U.S. foreign policy, but to understand the dynamics, understand that what we're experiencing today is nothing new per se, it's just taking a different form. Obama administration, in these 2 cycles, deported over 3.5 million people out of the United States. It continued under Biden, and it will continue, right? In fact, Obama 2 terms was one of the most significant terms in terms of deportations and so forth. And I know we're going to get into that area later on.
Yeah.
But it's something
just
that
before we segue to this, Jacqueline, help me to understand this. In my mind, the strategic use of foreign aid by the United States ought to be to make things better in the home countries, and hence stymie the push factor to whether it's to migration in general and certainly illegal migration. Because people are running because they're scared of cartels. People are running because the economies are depressed. People are running because of gender-based violence issues, etc. If you assist with uplifting those societies, you will not have a migration problem. So isn't it counterintuitive to cut aid and expect a reduced migration issue? I don't know. I'm conflicted. It seems confusing to me and not necessarily the right approach.
Well, the UK is a classic example of that. It's cut aid across the Horn of Africa, and of course, people are coming in swaves, across land and then ending up in France and then coming across the Channel in small boats. You've probably heard of the small boat phenomenon. Very small numbers of people in my mind, but it's still because England's a relatively well-off country and it has space and it can cope, but it makes a big thing of it and says it can't cope. But some of the issues that are going on in those countries wouldn't be affected in any differently by the sums that Britain gives in aid. Climate change and the climate crisis is forcing a lot of people to flee. War, famine, ethnic disputes, religious discrimination, political persecution, all the sorts of reasons that are forcing people out of those countries and making those extremely hazardous journeys and selling everything they've got to pay smugglers and traffickers, meaning therefore that these must be extremely desperate people, and then going on to prove their cases across Europe, and particularly in courts and so forth, to show that they were genuinely fleeing persecution, would not be impacted in any way were those countries to be given proper aid. Those countries, I think some of them are extremely derelict in their own duty to their own people. I visited some of them. I visited refugee camps, and there is a real issue across Africa and perhaps in the Caribbean too of leadership, I think, and I don't think that we put our own people first. So yes, we know that colonialism and neocolonialism and now neoliberalism is a factor in why some of these countries remain underdeveloped. Some of the leaders in those territories themselves are wanting. We're seeing some changes. There are some incredible changes, particularly in Francophone Africa, where there's some young fellas. We don't know whether they're going to continue on this road and be good and so forth. But we're seeing some hope in Africa with some of the young leaders who are making change. We're seeing that in the Caribbean. You've got that in Grenada, a young dynamic leader. So I'm hopeful, but I don't necessarily think that aid really makes much of a difference. The aid is normally given really to keep people quiet, to buy people. I mean, I was involved in something last year where I happened to receive a document, and it was from the British government to another government. And this whole document was about literally giving this country some money so they could give this to Britain some intelligence about various routes that people were going to be using to get out of their country and end up in Europe. And so it's for their purposes, not for our purposes. Yes, some of that aid may trickle down and benefit some people in those countries, and it might make them less inclined to leave. But that's not what it's for. The aid is really to buy off the elites and to buy off leaders and to be seen. There is a small bit of it which is to be seen to be doing something right. So, I visited Nigeria with the British Home Office. And it was because at the time, Nigeria had the largest number of women who were being trafficked to the UK. And they were coming through Southern Europe and then ended up in the UK. Mainly, some of them were working in domestic servitude, but a lot of them were working in brothels as sex workers, etc. And we went there on a sort of mission, because a lot of the women were being duped. They were being told they were coming to England to get jobs, good jobs, or they were coming to England to go to school, and they were being duped. So it was an awful example of modern slavery. And some of the girls were underage, they were minors. And so we visited this house that Britain had built, and Britain had spent, I mean, I couldn't believe the figures. It spent something like 14 million pounds on this structure, which was meant to house young girls who had been saved or rescued from border points. So like the border, Cross River, Cameroon, that was one of the flashpoints in the borderline with Nigeria. They were rescuing young women and bringing them to what was deemed to be a safe house, and educating them and so forth. And we went to visit this so-called safe house, and it was a grim, grimy place. You kind of trundled up in a coach along a dirt road, and it was awful. And then you got to this place, and I mean, we come from Britain, so we know what a pound is worth and what a pound can buy you. And there was no way ever that place had cost even £100,000, let alone 14 million. And so we looked around, and we were all quite startled by it. And we got back into the coach, and there were representatives from the British government as part of that delegation. I said to them, well, these people haven't spent the money on this property. What are you going to do about it? So, we know. We just have to give certain amounts to this government and that government, keep them quiet. Also that they give us intelligence. With Nigeria, we get intelligence on Boko Haram. So by doing that, we get intelligence on Al-Qaeda and ISIL and ISIS and all of those organizations as they were at the time. And that's what it's about. It's not about Nigerians benefiting, and it won't be about Grenadians benefiting.
Mm-hmm. All right. So yes, so I will share with you, and I will always argue that the persons, the organizations, the countries, mainly countries that provide aid, have their own foreign policy objectives, right? Whether it's ranging from colonial guilt to some of the things that my colleague Jackie McKenzie has articulated. But what is important for us as recipients of aid is to organize ourselves, to organize our business and our mentality and so on, to leverage that aid for good, to make use, to maximize its use for the benefit of the people. So let us, yes, you have your foreign policy objectives, whether you have to, your foreign aid must be 2% of your GDP or whatever, and you're finding ways to meet that so you can go on the global stage and say, I have met my, global responsibility. That's fine. But what about our responsibility in islands like this? It's to leverage that assistance, maximize it, and let it be served as a catalyst to fit our own development goals.
As Jackie pointed out, leadership is actually critically important in order to make sure that, one, we negotiate well, but we use the monies appropriately.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And leadership at all levels.
Agreed.
Not just at the political level, but the institutional level, the ministerial levels, and at the ground level. Okay. Right?
It is time for our final break. So viewers and listeners, we take our final break, and when we come back, we'll wrestle with some of the impact of the tariffs proposed on Grenada and on the region, and certainly the deportation, if it occurs, of Grenadians. We'll be right back.
Get ready to celebrate Grenada's independence with Star style, and pride. It's Grenada at 51 with Minister Andy Williams and the St. George's Baptist Church. The Pure Grenada Independence Concert.
Grenada, you're nice.
Saturday, February 8th at the Monrouge Playing Field from 6 p.m. Featuring an incredible lineup of talent. Enjoy performances from the legendary Ajamo, Randy Isaacs, Sour Serpent, Rootsman Kelly, Valley Ned, and Young Sang. Plus the amazing Sabrina Francis, Laura Lisa, Lion Pride Dancers, and playwright Francis Urias Peters, all backed by the KOS Band.
And the best part,
This concert is absolutely free. So gather your friends and family and come celebrate Grenada's 51st anniversary of independence with pride. Let's make this a night to remember.
Looking to shop online from your favorite stores like Amazon and Shein? With GPC Global, it's never been easier. Get your very own US address and shop from around the world. With GPC Global, you can order the latest trends and must-have items, all delivered straight to Grenada to your closest post office for your pickup. We offer the cheapest rates, and our service is reliable and quick. No more waiting for weeks for your packages. Your satisfaction is guaranteed. Join the Grenada Postal family today and start shopping smarter. Visit us online at www.grenadapostal.com or call us on 437-POST. That's 437-7678. GPC Global, your gateway to the world.
Are you looking for a reliable, affordable, and customer-friendly pharmacy? Look no further than Hills and Valley Pharmacy, the nation's leading healthcare products and services provider. We are committed to serving you at convenient locations. Find an extensive and affordable selection of prescription and over-the-counter drugs and medical supplies at Church Street, Hillsborough, Carriacou, Jubilee Street, Grenville, St. Andrew, near the bus terminal, and Halifax and Grenville Street, St. George. Our committed team is always available to offer valuable assistance for managing your health and wellness. Discover the additional benefits of our wholesale distribution on Halifax Street and our Medcare Center on Grenville Street, where we provide in-house physiotherapy, massage therapy, doctor consultations, and eye care services. Our commitment is to satisfy all your healthcare needs, including competitive prices, loyalty rewards, and special discounts for seniors. Contact us at 435-6904 and WhatsApp 535-4734. Choose Hills and Valley Pharmacy. Remember, your health is our business.
Welcome back, viewers and listeners. Of course, we're dealing with the ripple effects of the new U.S. policies on Grenada and the Caribbean, but certainly the potential effects. You certainly can join in the conversation, 440-1252, that's the number. Jackie, what impact do you anticipate the immigration policies as announced will have on the Grenadian diaspora? But we have our first caller, so let's take that caller and then you'll be able to respond. Good evening, caller, welcome.
Good night, Mr. Dowe. And good night to your guest, Dr. Fletcher. You're a very, very hard man to find. But let me congratulate you. This panel tonight. I listened to the two, the lady and gentleman there, and I'll tell you something. This is what I like to hear. We have to be brave and bold. Dr. Fletcher, we have it here. We can do it for ourselves. We can be internal. Yes, we know we are interdependent, but we have to be a little more independent of ourselves. We have the monies, we have the brain power, we have everything it takes to shift this little country. I believe we cannot be afraid of the larger powers because you rule by the brain and not by the guns. So don't be frightened to go out there and to tell them exactly they're the problem. And I'm saying here, so if the government is going to listen to you and this lady there, in terms of what I heard tonight, we are well on our way to real success, because this is exactly what I have been doing over the years. I would like to meet you someday with my for my little parish there. Exactly as you're outlining there, we have to shift this country. And I believe that the biggest problem we have in terms of the development of Grenada are the politicians. Yeah? They don't listen to the citizens. They don't listen to the technical people. As a result of that, they leave us behind. So if we could get them to listen and to follow us and not we following them, I think we'll make a big, big difference. So Grenada will be on its way. If not, I'll tell you something. We are heading for serious, serious times.
Thank you very much, Kola, for that contribution. Well, the looking inward being important, the Kola just emphasizing that. Jackie, what do we anticipate will happen based on this new immigration policy as we look at the diaspora? Jackie, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. I do apologise. The caller, by the way, that was really great. Determination, and it would be lovely to hear a little bit more about his project in his parish at some point. But in terms of immigration, and I think a lot of that's blustering. I mean, we saw it here in the UK with, the Rwanda Economic Partnership. The US, I mean, we've seen of farms and construction sites where no one's turned up to work. And these countries are quite hypocritical. They know that they need migration. They know, or immigration rather, they know that they need people, documented and undocumented. It's all quite worked out down to, the nearest couple of thousand. And they're not going to be able to survive without it. So Trump has won an election partly based on having a hard line towards immigrants and black people and so forth and brown people. We've had exactly the same thing in Britain. We've seen it across Europe in places like Italy with Meloni and Hungary and so forth. So we're seeing that trend of organizations and parties heading to the right and using migrants as scapegoats. But their economists and their statisticians are all telling them behind closed doors that you need these people. So we will see the dramatization of this deportation plan in the early days, and we've seen some of it already. We saw people being shackled and put onto planes to Colombia and Mexico. No doubt we'll see some more of that. And those are deportations which are easy to do because you're simply going into the prisons and just grabbing people and putting them in handcuffs and shackles and putting them on a plane. Now, where due process comes into that, God knows, because those people ought to have some sort of right of appeal against deportation. So no doubt there'll be a lot of litigation happening. But less easy to find people who are out in your society living their lives, of which there will be numbers of Grenadians who are undocumented. What might happen is that they may all start going into hiding and will stop working, and that's where the issue of remittances, because some of them look after their families in Grenada, so that's going to be a knock-on effect. But it's not going to be that easy for them to get the majority of them and send them back. So that's the first thing. In terms of the deportees, those who are coming out of prisons, there are some issues for the Caribbean. I don't like to overplay it because I think a lot of people go to prison and they get rehabilitated or reformed. And of course, a lot of innocent people go to prison too. And they come out and they live, lives like the rest of us. But there is no doubt, and there is evidence to show that there is some flashpoints with people who come back. So in Jamaica, which I have a connection to, there have been problems with gangs. So, the gangs in Jamaica and the gangs in America being affiliated. And when some of those people have been deported from Jamaica, from the US, to Jamaica, a couple of them have, or more than a couple actually, have gotten involved in some awful crime. And, there's a whole song about it, deportee. And so that's a flashpoint and a worry, because some of these CARICOM countries aren't able to keep a lid on their own problems with crime. And we've seen Trinidad with its state of emergency, and all we're seeing every day coming out of Trinidad is headlines, even in the state of emergency, of awful killings, including of children and women. Grenada has a worrying trend. I don't think it's got to a crisis point, but we are seeing some statistics and some types of crimes that that should really have us all seriously concerned about them. We saw in St. Vincent. I mean, I was in Barbados recently, when on the news there was that their crime rate had gone up exponentially. So there's real problems. And if you've got gangs and people from gangs and so coming back as deportees into these countries with weakened security systems, then I think it's problematic. But in terms of the general populace, I think it will all settle down. I think Trump, like Britain with its Rwanda plan, will make a lot of noise. There'll be a lot of blustering. There'll be a lot of visual. But at the end of the day, they're going to suddenly realize that we need people. And I really don't expect to see large numbers of people going anywhere.
How does the closure?
But I don't expect it.
How does the closure of like the DI offices, etc., impact on Grenadians or Caribbean people within the diaspora?
Well, I mean, I'm amazed that there are so many Grenadians, and I've met them in New York and places and Florida, who can be, can sort themselves out and don't. And we've seen, I mean, in terms of the visuals, one of the things we saw last week was a high-profile raid on an immigration law firm in the States, where files were taken. I mean, all of these are fundamental breaches of human rights. And I mean, it's just shocking, absolutely shocking. Hopefully some of, the international organizations, the UN, I mean, I don't know that these organizations really have much power, but let's hope that there'll be some pushback. My only hope, and I don't want to turn your program into a party political or party, I certainly don't want to get you into any trouble, but I mean, Trump's got one term, hasn't he? He can only have one term unless he changes the law, and but he can only have one more term because he's had one. I think they can only have two, and God forbid if we get his son. But we're now seeing already, aren't we, people in the Latin American community saying, gosh, we didn't really know what we were voting for. There were black people who voted for Trump who are now, so let's just hope this is a one-term thing. 4 years is a long time. It's some sanity, because we are going to see shocking. I don't think never shocking to make feel.
Okay. Just one last thing before we turn our attention is that the question is whether the individuals who were rounded up, and I think you alluded to it, they went amok of the law. So it's not merely that they were illegal plus conducted some other illegal activities, which is why they got into the crosshairs of ICE. Should we be empathetic to that group saying, you're already illegal, behave yourselves? Should not be the case, rather than us saying, oh my goodness, what are they doing to them?
Well, if you're an American citizen, you can't be removed unless your citizenship is revoked, and that will only be revoked. I think they've got laws that allow them to do that in the same way we have in Britain. If you've committed crimes like terrorism, usually it's very serious crimes. But although in Britain we're seeing mission creep, because now it's for sex offenders and tomorrow it'll be for drug dealers, and so they start off with a high threshold and it starts cascading its way down so that everybody who's black and brown can get caught up in it if you commit a crime. But what you've got in America, they've obviously started off with people who were in prison. I mean, I've looked at some of the information, some of the data, and it's very scant. But there are some organizations collating this information. And we're seeing people who were not American citizens, but who had green cards and who were in prison on, so they would have been serving out the rest of their sentences, almost an IFAs, really, very, very long sentences. And they may be quite happy to have gotten out of prison and go, because they're not likely to be put into prison in Colombia or Mexico and so forth. They may, and there is actually some a negotiation for those countries to imprison people. They're simply transferring them from one prison to another, and we saw that in Jamaica yesterday or day before, I think. But that's generally not what happens. People just go back to those countries and they're free. So they are going after the easy targets, those who aren't citizens, who have no legal status in the country. But you can have legal status in a country, like in Britain, you can have indefinite leave to remain or be settled and still be deported because you've committed a crime. And I'm one of the people who is very opposed to that and would be very opposed to it in the US context, because it should be when you have committed a crime, you go to prison, rightly so, if that is the sentence or the right way of dealing with that particular crime, because I don't always think prison is the right way to deal with all types of offences. But in some cases, you go to prison and you come out, and that should be the end of it. What we are seeing is a kind of double punishment where people are then stripped away from their families, their lives, their colleagues, etc. And sometimes, so for instance, in the UK, you can be deported after a 12-month sentence. You can get a 12-month sentence in England for a driving offence. You could have been born in Britain, or you could have arrived as a baby, and that's the only country you know. And all of a sudden, you're just picked up, put on a plane, and sent to a country where you don't know anybody. That sort of thing is wrong, very wrong in my opinion.
Okay, understood. Stephen, I want us just to turn on some of the economic factors now. So how will these tariffs, which have been postponed 1 month, 30 days as it stands now, but the tariffs earmarked for Mexico, Canada, China, we are looking at a 25% Mexico, Canada, 10% for energy in Canada, and 10% on China. How do you envision this impacting us in the region in terms of our economics now?
So a couple of things before I enter directly. There's been a change in pattern in the actual deportation policy in the U.S. Under Obama, over 90% of the 3-point-something million persons that were actually deported were for criminal nature. That declined to something like 36% under Trump and continues. So I just say that to establish that more and more we are going to be seeing less criminals being deported and more of the broad-based so-called illegal entrance into the U.S. And that's part of the reason why we must plan. It's part of the reason why we must have a multi-party approach towards this issue. Joint Ministerial Committee, the NGO community, the churches, I think,
and get together. A reintegration plan.
Yes.
Assuming that they had some connection to Grenada, because as Jackie pointed out, if you went up as a child, you're a green card holder, you committed a crime, they can send you back, but there's no connection to country.
Yeah. So I think it's important for us to begin to plan and to think through, have some contingency plans in place along those lines. To the issue of tariffs, you know, tariffs have had a long history, right? The traditional economic thinking is that if you place tariff on an import item, you are trying to achieve two policy goals. One is to make this item expensive, and therefore the Treasury, the National Treasury, receives some more money from it. Now that is providing that the quantity of imports, the volume of imports continue to rise or remain stable.
There's a good demand, strong demand for it.
Right. The second objective is sometimes to encourage and force domestic production, domestic fine-tuning, domestic technological change and evolution. So that's part of what we have to look at. From the Grenadian perspective, of course, we are a small, import-based country. The majority, a significant portion rather, of the inflationary impacts that we feel currently without the tariffs are actually imported inflation, as economists would call it. These are high rising cost of living that we have no control over, but we have to consume it because we import those items. Now, If we are to continue with our current import trends of importing from the United States and Canada and so on, we are going to feel the impact. The impact will certainly be inflationary. The cost of living on our people that are already high will continue to rise, and that is going to be one of the impacts.
What are some of the common and popular items that we import from the U.S. and Canada just off the top?
Right. Significantly, food items. Food items, and this is where Grenada is really suffering. Right. Our inflation is fundamentally food-related inflation.
Right. And based on what you said, U.S. imports, Mexico, Canada, increases the prices within the U.S. As well. And if those are inputs into things that are exported to us, we get it twice.
And there's an indirect relationship as well. We have citizens who live in those societies who have to pay this increased cost of living.
Right.
How will that impact on remittances?
Which really is the second largest foreign exchange earner for Grenada after tourism.
Right? It impacts on funds send money. It also impacts investment, construction of their houses, construction of their homes, purchase of lands. It's likely to have an impact. But one of the other impact is that, so let us take China, for example. There is a 10% leverage on China. Now, the U.S. response to that is, look, we are trying to settle this deficit that we have, this trade deficit. So I think in Canada it's 64 billion deficit, Mexico is whatever, China is. So they're trying to close that gap, they say. But I think it's much deeper than that. The point is that if we now as Grenada begin to change our source of imports, could we not also see a lowering in the cost of living? Can we look at Africa? Can we look at direct purchases from the People's Republic of China? Because if we purchase directly from those sources, we are not going to suffer from the tariff.
And likewise, Mexico and Canada are huge suppliers to the U.S.
Absolutely.
So the question is, can we go directly to Mexico? Can we go directly to Canada rather than going through the third party?
So that requires some rethinking on the part of our businesses here, as well as to how we reposition ourselves given what is happening, given the global space. Now, I know that there is a move to look at Guyana, for example, as a source. Recently, I think there was a delegation, a business delegation from Grenada, led by the Prime Minister, that visited Guyana, and to explore business opportunities there. There are multiple opportunities in countries like Belize, Mexico itself, Colombia, and so forth. So we have to begin to reshape our import places to get rid of this. Every 8 or so years, you're faced with this economic issue, the cost of things. But part of it on the food, I must come back to this. We can do much better domestically and regionally at producing more of what we eat and eating more of what we grow. And certainly the agricultural policies pursued by the SIAP and so forth, they're really aimed at doing that. But we have to ramp up. We have to bring more of the idle lands that we are seeing around the country into real production. Remember, one of the slogans of the PRG period was idle hands.
Idle lands for idle hands.
For idle hands. Right. And idle hands plus idle lands equal production. So there's a productivity issue as well that we have to look at. You go into the supermarkets, sweet potatoes going at $7 and $8 per pound, tomatoes at ridiculous prices. So we have to begin to look at that. And thankfully, though, they were beginning to see policies that are going to impact on that. So, for example, greenhouses, there will be an explosion of that. Shaded houses and so on, you're going to see that happening. Hydroponics, you're going to see some of that. So I think the Grenadian thinking is beginning, and policy is beginning to shift to look more and more at how we can, in fact, embark on feeding ourselves. Recently, I must reference this because that's where I work, so I know it. The Rural Development Units launched this backyard gardening program, in which we made available, of course, it's not enough, but it's a dent we're trying to make, where we provided backyard tools, planting planting material to over 80-something households in Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. Initiative like this is what's going to help to provide home food security and to help the input bill. The tariff, let's go a little bit further on the tariff issue. And I'll just round it up by saying that we have to be prepared to see increase in prices at our supermarkets once these tariff measures get into place. Okay. It can also have impact on issues of foreign exchange. Right. It means that now we have to pay more, we have to get more foreign exchange to buy the same amount of goods, right? What that means for foreign exchange and what is the impact of that on, for example, how much more tourists we attract, how much more foreign exchange, but also much goods. Nutmeg, cocoa, or export of real commodities that also allows us to earn foreign exchange. Where are they? Are they part of that conversation? Are they part of that policy space in which we are going to seek to rebalance the impact of tariff on the foreign exchange needs
and the importance of secondary processing coming again, because it can't be just raw nutmegs and the cocoa beans.
Absolutely, and it cannot be just pure export the raw material. Right. We have to put our minds seriously, not in a minuscule way of saying we're into agro-processing. And you have organizations like the GCNA and so on who is into minuscule in agro-processing. The Cocoa Association has done very well so far in moving to that second level of chocolate manufacturing. They got 2 factories now that are involved in converting cocoa to chocolate. And recently, for example, I approached the manager of the Cocoa Association and asked the question, if we were to convert 90% or more of our cocoa production into byproducts of cocoa, cocoa powder, chocolates, and so on, how will that impact on your revenue? What will be the revenue impact? Would you be making more money than exporting the raw bean? Will you be making less? What will be the impact? And it's not just the revenue, but what will it do for intellectual capital, for skill set in chocolate and employment and so forth. Okay. So we have to begin to think in those ways.
Jackie, we're approaching time, but I just want to get from you, will the world stand by and allow the expansion of Guantanamo Bay to be a detention center? We heard that there's a movement on now to just massively expand Guantanamo Bay as part of the show for dealing with the illegal immigrants. Will the world stand by and allow that type of thing to happen?
Well, it stood by and allowed lots of innocent people to be there, didn't, during the whole period against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth. And, I worked for one of the law firms that was very instrumental in bringing Brits home who were stuck in Guantanamo Bay, but it's not popular. I think the land is owned by the US, and so they will be able to do things. But there is a distinction between deportation and removal. So deportation, and even in the US law, you should have a criminal conviction to be deported. You can't be deported if you don't have a criminal conviction. Everything else that happens is actually an administrative removal. So if you're an overstay, it's an administrative removal. So there are 2 different things, and there's different laws covering both of those things. And Stephen is right that we will now see more administrative removals than we've seen in the past. But my view is that it's going to be very difficult to do it, because those people are the people that the US society needs to do those jobs, to work on those farms and those construction sites in people's homes and so forth. So I don't think we're going to see the large numbers. We will probably see the removal of some people who are serving criminal sentences to Guantanamo Bay, and the world should not stand by and allow that to happen. The conditions in Guantanamo, and as I said, because I've worked for a law firm that's been involved in doing cases for people who are in Guantanamo Bay, are austere, are inhumane. I can't imagine that they've changed. I certainly can't imagine that they will change now, that you're dealing with a different type of person. We shouldn't be, countenancing anything of the sort. But I think the world doesn't really have an appetite for much struggle these days. all sorts of things shouldn't be tolerated, but they happen.
Okay.
And that puts us in a very sad place, I think.
Unfortunate. Stephen, your closing comments, and as you give your closing comments, I just want you to touch on what does a weakened U.S. economy means for Grenada and Grenadians.
Yeah. So I will pivot from where my colleague Jackie has ended, which is to say for the administrative removals, one of the things that we can begin to look at, and the administrative removals as one category, but it might be those who elect on their own to return to Grenada because of the conditions in the U.S., partly a declining economy. Right. One of the things I believe that we ought to start looking at, what are some of the opportunities that may exist for some of these persons returning with the skill sets, resources, and so on? Can we find a space for them? So that excluding the criminals I'm talking about now, right? The administrative removals and those who elect to return home because of conditions. So we have to look at that, and that is part of the, in my view, in my humble opinion, I might be wrong, but it's an opportunity that we have now to embrace our persons who lived out there, who are willing to say, I'm getting back home because the stress, the strains, the uncertainties out there, I think I'll be much better in my smallest country and among my people. We must do that. A declining economy like the U.S. will always impact on us by obvious ways that we have mentioned over and over repeatedly. Grenada is not a recipient of U.S. private sector investment. The one example we have that is St. George's University, as we know. That's the best case scenario. And one or two other trippings of investments here and there, very minor investments. So St. George's University represents that major investment from the U.S. We are not a main attraction of U.S. investments. So a declining economy will not necessarily impact us in terms of investments. But remember, the U.S. is looking inwardly now. It's an inward look. Elon Musk and those guys have that inward look. But again, here we might see some contradictions as we talked about the foreign policy and deportations. Elon Musk and the big multinationals of the world need some of the very skill sets that is touted out there on the stage and the actor stage as persons that we must stop from coming in. They understand the value of skill talent. They understand the value of, can't remember the category of that visa that is used to attract skilled personnel. They understand that. So are we going to see at some point in time, and as Jackie alluded to, a scaling down of the rhetoric around the actual deportations and the administrative removals? One of the things we have to be mindful of, the declining economy and all that's happening in terms of U.S. policy, is that some of our citizens may very well end up receiving collateral damage from that policy, because it will have an impact on how many visas are given to Grenadians who want to travel to the U.S., whether on vacation, medical use, and so on, right? Medical purposes. It is going to have an impact. In other words, we can see a much more restrictive policy in that regard, less visas being issued to well-meaning, law-abiding citizens who wish to visit the U.S. So we have to also begin to think and counsel ourselves to see that this is likely to be an issue. The economic issue, again, to come back to the main question, the impact is always in prices, but also we can see it in tourism. If the economy continues to decline or declines in the U.S. to the point where citizens are not feeling sufficiently emboldened to take vacation and so on, I cannot afford it, or you take vacation and when you get back, your job is going to be there for you, that is going to impact. The other thing though, but on the bright side, think of this. With some of the uncertainties that exist in the United States, Grenada's Citizenship by Investment Program can be a beneficiary of this, all right? Because you may have very wealthy individuals out there who, in fact, might be thinking, I need to have a second citizenship just as an option. I may wish to exercise that. And therefore, we can possibly see an uptick in applications from the U.S. to our forward
Well, over the last year, we've already seen an uptick from the U.S., and the question is whether we target people of color who are being impacted by some of these policies to take on a Grenadian citizenship.
Right. So I think that is one of the strategic moves that the IMA is making, which is to target heavy net worth individuals, persons of means who have certain skill sets, who have resources and so on, that can contribute directly to the overall development and trust of Grenada.
And that is the citizenship by invitation trust is what you're referring to?
Absolutely, by invitation.
By invitation.
Absolutely.
All right, it's time for us to wrap, but I always let the lady have the last word. So Jackie, you have the last word.
I suppose I should end on a positive note, actually. I've just spent quite a bit of time in Grenada. In fact, I said 2 months, it was almost 3 months. And, you know, I was in Woburn, which is a little coastal village in the south there. Beautiful to me, being unbiased, but the most beautiful part of Grenada, but with social challenges, of course, like lots of areas. And what I see, though, is some great young people, you know, doing things that just instill so much hope in me. And I think we just have to be confident. You know, somebody mentioned Maurice Bishop earlier on, and he always cautioned us about, you know, the begging bowl mentality, you know, going around and begging for things. And of course, international aid's important, and you know, bilaterals and agreements with other countries. I mean, Grenada did well, you know, in getting an airport with the support from the Cubans and others who had the technical know-how. So, of course, that's important. Leadership is important so that when things do come into the country, they are well used and well utilized. But I think that when I talk about the country almost appearing as a school and being run by a PTA, because we have an event for this and event for that, and, you know, people fundraising and all sorts of crazy things going on, rather than a big story. You know, where's the big story? I'm looking for the big story. Where's the big plan? We have bright people, we have bright young people, we have energetic people, we have land, we've got resources, we've got the diaspora. Where is our big plan? And I think that's really what I want to see more of, rather than these little events. And I think we're going to get there. I think Grenada's going to get there. I'm sure Singapore didn't, you know, rely on aid from anybody, and look where it is today. And I always think of Grenada in that context. Small, you know, I'm half Jamaican, and we have a saying, we look up with Talawa. And Grenada's definitely little and Talawa. I think it really just ought to be confident and go for it in its own way.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline McKenzie, Dr. Stephen Fletcher. Thank you both for sharing on this topic, the ripple effects of the new U.S. policies. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, for spending the last 90-plus minutes with us as we discuss this issue. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, you make this program possible. Let me close off by saying a happy 51st Independence to all of you. The call by Jacqueline in closing was that Vision 75, we can call it. Look internally, let us grow, let us support each other for a better Grenada. Use what may appear to be challenges to be opportunities for nation building. Thank you so very much once again for being with us. Happy 51st anniversary of our independence, and I look forward to being with you again in the next 6 days, 22 hours and 20 minutes. Take good care. Godspeed.